Okay, I'm reading from one of Shakespeare's sonnets, Sonnet 20, and it's my favourite one, I think. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou, the master, mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change as is false women's fashion. An eye more bright than theirs, less false in rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. A man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature, as she wrought thee, fell a-doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use their treasure. And now I'm going to read from a poem by Aphra Behn, who wrote in the late 17th century, and it's called To the Fair Clorinda, who made love to me, imagined more than a woman. Fair lovely maid, or if that title be too weak, too feminine for nobler thee, permit a name that more approaches truth, and let me call thee lovely, charming youth. This last will justify my soft complaint, while that may serve to lessen my constraint, and without blushes either youth pursue, when so much beauteous woman is in view. Against thy charms we struggle but in vain, with thy deluding form thou givest us pain, while the bright nymph betrays us to the swain. In pity to our sex sure wert thou sent, that we might love and yet be innocent. For sure no crime with thee we can commit, or if we should, thy form excuses it. For who that gathers fairest flowers believes a snake lies hid beneath the fragrant leaves? Thou beauteous wonder of a different kind, soft Chloris with the dear Alexis joined, whene'er the manly part of thee would plead, thou tempts us with the image of the maid. While we the noblest passions do extend, the love to Hermes, Aphrodite the friend.
Hi Kate, you are the Academic Programme Leader of Literature and Media at Brighton University, and I'd like to know why you picked Shakespeare's Sonnet 20 and Aphra Behn To the Fair Clorinda to speak about today.
Okay, partly because I teach them, and I really enjoy using these two poems to talk about how gender is very performative in the Renaissance and the early modern period, but also about how erotic they are, how explicitly erotic the speaker is towards somebody of a slightly ambiguous or unknown gender. And I think both the authors play with that idea and play with the voicing of that idea. So that really attracts me because it relates to my own life, it relates to my own teaching. I think it's very contemporary. And I'm currently doing a lot of work on Aphra Behn. I'm sharing some work for Cambridge University Press.
Wow.
And one of the things I'm noticing is how much she uses Shakespeare. So she's almost in dialogue with Shakespeare. So you have this late 17th century woman who's the first professional playwright, comes from a really similar background to Shakespeare, not an aristocratic background, working background. She makes her own life in the stage. She's in the theatre, I should say. And she's the most successful playwright of her generation. Shakespeare, same, but he's a man, and yet they're doing quite similar things. And she's talking to him, I think, in her poem. She's talking to his poem as well.
So it's kind of a response to her influences.
Yeah, I think so. It's very subtextual, but that's what I think. Yeah.
That's brilliant. When did you first come into contact with these two poems, and what effects do you think they've had on you, both personally and professionally?
Well, when I was given that question as one of the questions you might ask, I was trying to think back through my life and think, well, when did I first come across them? And in a way, it's kind of lost in the mist of time when I first read them. I long ago read a book by Lillian Faderman called Surpassing the Love of Men. And I actually read it before I went to university, and it was about sort of tracing poems, texts, artists in the past who might have evoked lesbian themes. And I probably read the Aphra Behn poem then, but I don't explicitly remember it, but I'm pretty sure it's in that work. So I came to it again when I wrote a book on Aphra Behn about 10, 12, 13 years ago. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. And at that point, I'd been teaching some Shakespeare sonnets, and I thought, this is also Shakespeare's Sonnet 20. And so from that point, I began using them as a teaching tool to juxtapose them. The second, remind me what there was the second bit to your question. So that's kind of how I first came across them.
And what effects do you think they've had on you, both personally and professionally?
Yeah. Okay. So personally, I think it encourages me to think that 400 years ago, there were people who played with ideas about gender. That although you look at conduct books of the period, which tell women to be in a particular way and men to be in a particular way, you read the literature and it plays around with that and it turns it upside down and it offers us all sorts of other opportunities. And so it tells us that 400 years ago, even if the courts, even if the church, even if the king is telling us to be in a particular way, we ignored it. People ignored it,
so
and that's very liberating.
It's a method of rebellion.
Yeah, yeah. So there's that. There's the fact that I think they express a kind of diversity of eroticism, and that attracts me on a personal level. And then I like the idea that there's this debate between those two authors because of their similarity, and I think that nobody else is picking that up enough. You know, no other scholars are really thinking, well, why don't we match Aphra Behn with Shakespeare? Why is Aphra Behn invisible and Shakespeare so visible?
So it's these forming these links of themes and trying to bring Behn more as popular as
I think that's part
Shakespeare.
of a purpose that I would like to see happen, you know, over the next 10 years.
That'd be brilliant.
And of course that's why I teach her as well.
Well, obviously both these poems present ideas which at the time of writing would have been very subversive. Which one of the two would you say was more challenging to the status quo?
Wow, that's an interesting question, an impossible one to answer. Probably the Aphra Behn one. Yeah. Because it's written by a woman and it's in a woman's voice. So
they used to be marginalised more often.
That's right. And also Shakespeare giving voice to a kind of homoeroticism was surprisingly more acceptable in his culture than a woman giving voice to an erotic interest in another woman. You know, it's a little bit like the Queen Victoria thing, that it's the invisibility of lesbians or of just some kind of erotic attraction between women, or just women doing things with women, whatever they might be, away from the eyes of men or the eyes of culture. So, and in that sense, I think it's interesting. It's interesting she published it. It was out there in the public domain. And the voice here is in the voice of a woman, and she's deliberately playing with the idea that her beloved is both woman and man, or maybe not. Which is this person? You know, do they have a female body or a male body, or do they have a little bit of both? And so you know, she makes the joke about the hermaphrodite at the end.
Like whether gender is even relevant in that kind of context.
I think she does ask that, although I think actually she wouldn't say that, because I think she finds the doubleness erotic.
Oh.
So you need that idea of gender to create that idea of crossing boundaries as erotic, and I think that's what she's doing. So if you didn't have that fundamental idea of gender as binary, her poem wouldn't work. And yes, okay, it would be wonderful if we exploded that idea, but she's actually saying that by being a little bit of both, the object of her erotic attentions, erotic attraction is enhanced.
So similar to Woolf's essay on the, what's the word again? It begins with A.
Androgyny.
Yes. Yeah, it's similar to that.
Yeah, a little bit, I think. I mean, obviously Woolf is kind of contentious. What did she mean by that term androgyny? Did she mean that kind of flattened out gender or flattened out sexuality, or did she mean that you had a bit of both and that had its own erotic charge? And there has been a critical debate, I'm sure you know about that. But certainly Woolf looked back to Aphra Behn, as you know, in A Room of One's Own. She talks about, every woman writer or every woman should lay flowers on the grave of Aphra Behn. I'm not sure how much Aphra Behn Woolf actually read, mind you. You don't see her kind of citing it. And when she writes, I'm moving on to Virginia Woolf here, but when she writes Orlando, which is the book that goes back over 500 years and looks at somebody changing sex during the 18th century from having been a man to becoming a woman, she quotes Pope, she quotes Addison, she quotes Shakespeare, she quotes middle 17th century. She doesn't quote any of Aphra Behn, and it's kind of this glaring gap in Virginia Woolf's work, which is a little bit of a shame, really. But there we go. That's Virginia Woolf for you. A wonderful woman, of course. A wonderful woman.
To what extent do you believe these two poems reflect the attitudes of their authors?
Yeah, that's another really hard question, but a really interesting one. And I'm not sure I can answer it. In both cases, of course, they have taken on a persona here. So, you know, Shakespeare, in all of his sonnets, we don't know if he's writing to a real person. He is writing a sonnet as if he were a man in love with a young-ish man. And here, is this a woman who is in love with another woman, or is it just an imagined woman? And both of them are playwrights, so they're adept at imagining characters that are given a particular set of ideas to follow through to the end in terms of action. So that's a kind of bit of a smokescreen, perhaps you might think. If you're asking personally, what do I think or what do I imagine, and let's go with that, because I was recently talking about this idea of a kind of I called it a lesbian imaginary, but let's call it a kind of homosocial or a gay imaginary. That in that gay imaginary, both of these poems come from those authors, somewhere in those authors' desire to put those ideas out there, into the 17th century. Aphra Behn wrote a few other poems that were to women that talk about a kind of eroticization of love. But she obviously had affairs with men as well. Maybe she was married to Mr. Behn, but what she was certainly doing was diversifying ideas about sexuality through the voice of a woman, and that's what's really important to me, I think. Yeah.
That kind of freedom.
Yeah, and she acted it out. You know, she didn't just write about it in private, she acted it out in her life. She wrote plays that acted it out on stage. People went to see it and they talked about it. She was vilified at various points, yeah, but you know, she kind of held to that.
So she talked the talk, walked the walk.
She did,
situation.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. That's why I like her. I think she's great. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, do you feel that Behn needs to feature more prominently in education? And if so, do you believe that she should replace some of the Shakespeare which dominates the curriculum? Actually, we've already kind of answered that.
Yeah.
You kind of want to bring that because there's a lot of, you know, things that are relevant in both.
Yes.
A lot of similarities in Shakespeare.
Yeah.
So you've already kind of answered that.
Yeah,
And the answer is yes.
I have indeed. But I think the answer is yes, we should have more Behn on the curriculum. One of the problems with that is, for example, if you look at the Norton anthology, which you're studying for early modern at the moment, but the only Behn that's in there is the Oronuku, which is her novella, which is really a really good novel. But what she was successful for was her playwriting. She was the most successful playwright on the Restoration stage. She had the most plays put on, or equal with one other, I think. But in the Norton anthology, now, in 2015, we don't have any of her plays there.
It's odd.
I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it?
That's
That is
odd,
ridiculous.
since she had such a massive influence.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, it's
so
sad as well, but there we go.
Well, I completely agree with you.
Good.
And
Good.
I think that
It might be it.
that might be it.
Yes,
Yeah. Well,
thank
thank
you very
you.
much.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
That's all right. That's all right. It was a pleasure. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks.